And then on the other end, farmers need nitrogen and phosphorus. So we spend a huge amount of energy manufacturing fertilizers to provide those nutrients to farmers. And nitrogen in particular is extremely energy intensive. So about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer. So we have the system that doesn't seem to be working super well. It's good at some things, it removes pathogens, but it still has all of these other problems. So what we envision is actually taking those nutrients from our waste and moving them back onto the farm. And in fact, each of us every day produces enough fertilizer in our urine to grow the wheat for 1 loaf of bread. It's kind of amazing. And that's our vision at the Rich Earth Institute, is a world with clean water and fertile soil, achieved by recycling these nutrients. And we do that by engaging in research, education, and technological innovation to advance the use of human waste as a resource. So to explain a little bit more about why urine in particular, I'm going to talk about what's in wastewater. So most of what's in wastewater is just water. The waste part is a really tiny fraction, as you can see here in these charts. Here's another way to look at it. If you look at the circle on the left, you can see most of the circle is just water, and the urine and feces are really tiny slivers, and that's the volume of wastewater. So there's very little urine in wastewater. But almost all of the nutrients in wastewater came from urine. So urine contains about 75% of the nitrogen in wastewater and about 60 to 70% of the phosphorus. So if you could just take the urine out, you would be removing a really small volume, but you would be almost solving the nutrient problem. So that's why we focus on urine in particular. Urine is also a lot, contains very few pathogens compared to feces, so it's a lot cleaner and easier to work with. Okay, so here's another diagram just sort of showing this linear system that we have currently, where we expend huge amounts of energy to produce fertilizers, and then we spend huge amounts of energy trying to clean up nutrient pollution on the other end. And then here's this sort of closed loop cycle that we are working towards here at the Rich Earth Institute. And we actually do this here in Brattleboro. So in Brattleboro, we have the first community scale urine recycling program in North America. So we have about 200 people here in the area who donate urine to us, and we collect it. Last year, we collected about 10,000 gallons of urine, and we work with 4 different farmers to apply it on their fields. So we have actually achieved this closed loop, at least on a really small scale here. I'm going to talk a little bit now about that program and how it works. Yeah, so the first stage is collection. So some of the people that we work with have an actual installation of a toilet that diverts urine. So you can see on the top here is a porcelain urine diverting flush toilet where the urine drains separately through a drain in the front part of the toilet. On the bottom is a dry composting toilet that also has a urine diverter. And then on the diagram on the right, you can see there's some jugs. A lot of our donors use these transportable jugs to collect their urine, and we have a funnel that goes on the top of that. And then they bring the jugs to our depot that you see here, and the urine is pumped out and stored in these tanks, and then we come periodically and pump it out. So that's kind of how the collection works. We also operate a portable toilet business where we provide toilets for public events. And for people with permanent toilet installations, a lot of them have tanks actually buried in the ground outside their homes or sometimes in their basement, like you see here. And so these tanks, so for people who have tanks, we come and pump them out. And generally we do that once or twice a year in the spring or the fall. And this is our truck that we use, our bright yellow pea truck. And we collect the urine and bring it back to our research center in Brattleboro where we pasteurize it. So this is similar to the process that happens for pasteurizing milk. We just heat it to a certain temperature for a few minutes and that kills the pathogens, any pathogens that might be in it. Urine is pretty clean, but it can contain bacteria and pathogens. So we do this just to be absolutely sure that there's nothing dangerous in it. And that meets all of the permitting requirements that are needed for the state. After it's pasteurized, we apply it to the field. And we have this custom applicator that we designed. We currently apply only to hay fields. As I said, we work with 4 different farmers and we have a long waiting list of farmers who would like to get fertilizer. We have far more demand than we have supply. So there's definitely a lot of support in the community for the program. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit into some of the research we have done and are doing now and what we're going to be doing into the future. So some of the earliest trials that we did were looking at how urine works as a fertilizer. We were pretty sure that it worked pretty well because other people have used it throughout history. But here's some physical evidence. So you can see the dark green stripe in the middle here has been fertilized with urine, and the lighter green stripes on either side have not been fertilized. So, yeah. And here are those same results in a chart form. So for this trial, we tested straight urine, we tested diluted urine, and we compared it with synthetic fertilizer and with no fertilizer. And the 3 fertilizer treatments were not statistically significantly different. So basically, the fertilizer effect is comparable to synthetic fertilizer for the amount of nitrogen that's applied. So a few years ago, we got involved with the University of Michigan and the University of Buffalo to kind of expand the scope of our research. And that research included technological development and also included social research to understand how people perceive the idea of urine fertilizer and urine diverting toilets, and to understand what people's concerns were, and yeah, just make sure that we could learn what those are and incorporate them as we go along, so we're not surprised further down the road. And one of the questions that we hear a lot from people is about pharmaceutical residues. So we know that we take a lot of medicines, and a lot of those medicines are excreted in our urine. So people wondered, and we wondered too, what happens when you apply urine that has pharmaceutical residue to a crop? Does it get broken down in the soil? Does it get taken up by the plant? Does it enter the groundwater? Is this something that we should worry about? So we started this trial with those 2 universities that was funded by the EPA and the National Science Foundation. And we're actually in the final year of the trial right now. We have some lettuce growing on a plot just north of Brattleboro that we'll harvest and sample in a couple weeks. But basically what we did is we've assembled a list of common pharmaceuticals that are found in wastewater, representing a wide variety of chemical properties as well as different types of medicines. We added high levels of them to urine just to make sure that they were sort of like a worst case scenario. And then we grew lettuce and carrots and fertilized them with this spiked urine. And we took samples of the soil. We also took samples of the groundwater using these devices that you see here. These are basically barrels that are buried in the ground, and they collect water at the bottom of the barrel that's percolated through the soil, and you can pump it out using that white tube on the side. You can pump out the groundwater from each barrel. So it's a way of measuring what's leached through the soil. It's pretty cool. And then we also took samples of crop tissue. And what we found so far, again, it's still ongoing, so these are preliminary results, but basically it is possible to detect some pharmaceutical residues in edible crop tissue. But the levels are extremely, extremely small. So they are so small, like they're on like a nanogram per gram scale. So to give you an idea of how small that is, in order to get the amount of caffeine in 1 cup of coffee, you would have to eat a pound of lettuce every day for 2,000 years. So it's detectable, but probably not too much of a reason for concern. And these results agree with other people who've been studying this issue from other fertilizers like manure, which also contains pharmaceuticals, and sewage sludge. People are looking at this from different angles and kind of all converging on this same finding, like probably doesn't matter. At the same time, it's still a new field of research, so we don't want to say anything conclusively yet, but the results seem encouraging. So that's been a major focus of our work for the past few years. And next, I want to talk about kind of where we're going. This summer, we won a big federal kind of small business development grant to design a urine treatment system that can be installed in any building. And the idea for this system is that it would allow anyone in the country to sort of have their own urine diversion program without having us there to run and manage it for them. Because our program, even though it works really well, it's really labor intensive. And so we're thinking like, how can we help people to replicate this in other places? So we have this idea for a system that can be installed in a building in the basement, and it takes in urine and it basically produces a ready-to-use fertilizer product. And it goes through these 4 stages. I won't talk about all of them, but the most important ones are the pasteurization stage that I already talked about a little bit, and then concentration. And concentration is really important because most of urine is water, and water is really heavy. And there's a big environmental impact from trucking around lots of water. It burns a lot of diesel fuel. It requires a lot of storage tanks. It also requires a lot of tractor passes for the farmer. So if you could concentrate it, that would really improve the environmental performance of urine as a fertilizer. So that's kind of what we've been working on, in particular, is the concentration stage. And our early prototype used reverse osmosis for concentration. That didn't work very well because the membrane would get clogged all the time. And yeah, it was very energy efficient, but the membrane had to be replaced constantly, so it wasn't very practical. So what we're working on now is a technology that we call freeze concentration. And basically this works by slowly freezing urine, which causes which causes the water to freeze first as pure ice, and it leaves behind a really concentrated solution. So it's the same principle that's used sometimes to make hard liquor from cider, for example. So if you freeze hard cider, you can get a really concentrated alcohol called Applejack. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced this, but it's also the same principle. That's why we salt roads, is that a really salty solution will have a lower freezing point than water. So yeah, it's kind of hard. I don't think I explained that very well, but you can feel free to ask questions if you didn't get it. So here's an early prototype of the freeze concentrator. We would freeze it in that silver bag at the top, and then slowly melt it. And as it melts, the most concentrated stuff drains off first, and then it gradually gets less and less concentrated. And then at the end, it's mostly just water, pure water that's melting. So, and here's what that looks like. These are samples taken from the melting water that's draining off. So you can see on the left, the first stuff that's melting is really concentrated with the dark color. And then gradually it gets less and less concentrated. And basically the last stuff to melt is just pure water. And then if you pass it through the machine again, you can double the concentration. So so you're getting almost a 10 times concentration using 2 passes through the machine. And so that means 10 times fewer truck trips, 10 times fewer storage tanks, 10 times fewer tractor trips, which is good. And here's just another way of looking at that same data. So this is showing the concentration of the meltwater, the concentration of nutrients in the meltwater over time. You can see the first fractions of meltwater have a really high nutrient concentration, and then it drops off pretty fast. So we're not the only people in the world who are designing something like this. There are some teams in Europe that are also designing urine treatment systems. One is in Switzerland, and that's the thing that you see here. And the other one is in Sweden. And both of those products are, they're further ahead than we are. So this system in Switzerland is already being used to treat urine, and they produce a urine fertilizer product that's called Aurin. You can see in the corner here. It's available for sale in Zurich. Their system is pretty different from ours. They use really different process. They use a totally different path for doing their treatment. And it works, it's a great system, but it uses a lot more energy than we think our system will. And it also is much larger and more complicated. So it really only works for really large buildings and needs a lot of oversight. And the other system is in Sweden, and it's producing a dry fertilizer product, but uses an even greater amount of energy. So we hope that if this system, if we can get it to work, it will enable people to start collecting urine in large buildings of all kinds. Requires a little bit of replumbing, but of course we already have urine collecting devices in about half of our bathrooms in a lot of buildings, so it's not too much of a stretch. And if we were able to do that, we would, if we could collect all of the urine in the United States, we would save 960 billion gallons of water per year from avoided toilet flushing. And go a long way towards solving nutrient pollution problems in our waterways. And we would replace about 9 billion pounds of synthetic fertilizer that we currently use, which is not all of the synthetic fertilizer that we use in the US, but it's a lot. I think it's about 25 or 30% of the fertilizer that we use in the US. So just to share a little bit about some of the resources that we have on our website, if you are interested in using urine in your own garden, we have a guide for how to do that. We also have a guide that explains how we run our community collection program for people that are interested in replicating that program. And these are some of the people who fund our work and our partners. And yeah. So we like to end with this quote: "Pollution is nothing but the resources we're not harvesting. We allow them to disperse because we are ignorant of their value." Okay, so maybe I will stop here and take some questions, and then I can go on and talk about my own background a little bit more after that. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great. Would you like me to read the questions for you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we'll just start at the top. So is it simply pasteurized urine that is being spread, or does it have to be turned into a soil-based type fertilizer?
Yeah, it's just straight urine that's been pasteurized. You can use it as is. You don't really even have to pasteurize it if you are just using it in your own garden. But since we are collecting it from many different people and using it on commercial farms, we definitely want to pasteurize it.
Do you use human feces along with animal feces?
We currently only work with urine. Human feces is used as a fertilizer in the US in the form of sewage sludge, which it works as a fertilizer. It's got fewer nutrients than urine. It has a lot more organic matter, so it's good. It kind of enriches the soil. It improves the organic matter content of the soil. There are some issues with using sewage sludge as a fertilizer because sometimes other contaminants can get into sewage, like industrial wastes and things that maybe you don't want in your fertilizer. So there are some challenges with that. And there's a lot more pathogens in feces, which is another reason why we work just with urine.
Great. Do you ever get backlash from people from doing this kind of work to say that simpler? Do people judge you, or do they say what you do is gross, and does that affect the people wanting to work in this sustainable way?
Yeah, we don't really get that kind of feedback. I'm sure that there are people who think that, but if they think that, they don't tell us. They just walk away.
Are you only able to use human urine, or can you also use animal urine?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we do use animal urine. So livestock manure is a mixture of urine and feces, and sometimes bedding. And manure is used as a fertilizer everywhere around the world. So livestock urine is already used as a fertilizer everywhere. Yeah, as far as like household pets or something like that, I mean, yeah, in theory you could.
So this might kind of lead into the next question. So how do you know that urine works as a fertilizer? So sort of what's the biology or the chemistry behind it?
Yeah. So urine contains high amounts of nitrogen, and more moderate amounts of phosphorus, and they are in a soluble form, which makes them very plant available. They're already in the form that plants need them to be in. So when you apply it to the soil, the plants can immediately take up those nutrients. It's actually the same form that most synthetic fertilizers are found in. This is different from most organic fertilizers where the nutrients are bound up with carbon molecules. So like when you apply compost, the nutrients are not plant available, and you have to wait for microbes to break them down. So that has advantages and disadvantages. It means that it can be more difficult to time the release of nutrients to when your plants need the nutrients. But it also means if you get a big rainstorm, the nutrients are less likely to wash away. So there's advantages with both kinds of fertilizers. Yeah, it's kind of a tangent, but.
Great. How long has this urine recycling research been going on, and is it only in the East Coast?
Yeah, the Rich Earth Institute started in, I think, 2011. I've been working there for about a year and a half. But urine diversion has been going on in Europe for a lot longer than that. There was a big urine diversion movement in Sweden in the 90s, and most of the toilets, like those nice porcelain urine diverting toilets, those are all made in Sweden. So as far as the West Coast, there is some interest, and there's some people who have done portable toilet businesses where they recycle waste, but I don't think there's anyone working specifically just on urine yet. That may change in a few years.
Did you guys come up with the barrels that you showed in that slide?
The barrels. Yeah, I think they're just a cheap, large container. It's easy to get them, secondhand. They don't cost very much.
Are there regulations regarding using urine as a fertilizer for food crops?
Yes, there are a lot of regulations about that, and the regulations are different in every state. So we have a permit through the state of Vermont, and our pasteurization process is designed to fulfill the requirements of that permit. It produces a product that is permitted to be used on any crop in Vermont. So it's totally safe. Like, we could use it on food crops. We haven't done that yet just because we started with hay. But we are permitted to do that. We're not permitted yet to apply it in any other state. So we would have to go through that whole process again to do that.
When using urine as a fertilizer, do crops grow faster than using regular plant fertilizer?
I don't think they would really grow faster. Yeah. I mean, it does have that advantage that all the nutrients are readily available that I mentioned. So it depends what fertilizer you're comparing it to. But it's pretty comparable to most fertilizers. And one thing that's nice about it is that it's not only nitrogen and phosphorus, it also has all of the other nutrients that plants need. So just like we, have to take a vitamin with all the different minerals and nutrients that we need, plants also need like 14 different elements. And urine contains all of those. So it doesn't necessarily contain them in exactly the right amount, so you might have to supplement, but it's nice that it is contributing all of them.
How does the legalization of weed affect the urine sample and the fertilizer?
Yeah. Well, it shouldn't really affect the fertilizer, the urine itself, it's kind of like the pharmaceutical issue. There may be traces of THC or whatever in the urine, but basically once you add it to the soil, most of those things just get broken down anyway. What is interesting is that we're hoping that urine may be used as a fertilizer to grow hemp and marijuana. So we're actually doing some new trials. We just got a new grant to try working with urine with new types of crops that we haven't tried before. And one of those will be a hemp grower here in the Brattleboro area. So that's exciting.
Great. And staying with that same idea, do antibiotics in urine decrease the quality of the fertilizer due to the microbes' role in generating forms of nitrogen that plants can use?
Yeah, again, we don't entirely know every effect that pharmaceutical residues will have when we add them to the soil. So we've done this preliminary research looking at crop uptake and groundwater and soil levels in soil. We haven't really yet looked at impacts on, for example, the microbial community in the soil. So that's also something that we are hoping to look at in the future. But that said, again, we think more likely that the microbes will break down the antibiotics than the other way around. But yeah, we don't know for sure.
Do you think schools and other buildings will adopt the specific toilets you were talking about as this continues to gain popularity?
Yeah, we actually have some interest already from a school here in Brattleboro that's interested in installing some urine diverting fixtures. So yeah, it could be a great teaching opportunity and a way for people to learn about it while they're young, so they get used to the idea.
Yeah. And people who have small yards or gardens, will nitrogen and phosphorus be able to build up to damaging levels?
Yeah, if you are using your own urine in your own property, you're probably going to make a lot more urine than you need. So if you applied it all to your own land, that would probably be too much. And you could, if you have excess nitrogen, it can damage your plants. If you have excess phosphorus, well, actually both can cause, can run off into the environment and cause nutrient pollution. So, I mean, probably still better than putting it down the drain, but yeah, it's important if you are applying urine as a fertilizer to understand what the right application rate is. So we have a guide to that in the home use guide that I mentioned earlier, to help people understand, okay, how much should I actually put down? Depends what kind of crop you're growing and how much land you have, but yeah, that's important to think about.
Is there any way we could pipe urine around like we pipe around water?
Yeah, we could. It's something we've thought about. It would require a lot of infrastructure, but the thing is, in a lot of cities, the pipes that we have right now are reaching the end of their useful lives. So we actually have kind of a wastewater infrastructure crisis. I don't know if crisis is quite the right word, but we have a real problem with wastewater infrastructure that needs to be replaced soon, like in the next few decades. So on the one hand, that's a real problem. But on the other hand, it also is an opportunity. Like if we're already going to be digging up and replacing all of our pipes, maybe now is the time to also put in a separate pipe system for urine, or just to totally rethink that whole system. Like, is that even the way that we want to continue dealing with wastewater? So there's kind of a movement in the wastewater industry towards thinking about what we call distributed wastewater treatment, which is kind of which our system is basically an example of that. So rather than sending everything to one enormous centralized facility, which are astronomically expensive to build and operate, we can instead do something a little bit more like, I mean, I guess it's kind of like septic systems. So where each building could collect or partially treat or somehow help in the treatment process. So it's not 100% centralized. And there's different hybrid models of how that could work. But something people are definitely talking about.
Great. What type of outreach do you do to get urine donors?
Yeah. Well, we do like kind of, a lot of it is word of mouth. We sometimes do normal things like tabling at the farmer's market, or we set up a table at the co-op. When we do our portable toilet rentals, that also is a good outreach opportunity for us. So sometimes people get interested in it from that. Yeah.
Right. Are there any bigger issues for using urine as fertilizer? Like, do you think that this is a practice that could be, I guess I'll just stop there. Are there any bigger ideas for using urine as a fertilizer than just what you're doing now?
Bigger, ideas?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess what would be the next step?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've thought a lot about that. Like, how can we like facilitate other people to do what we're doing? And that's partly why we wrote that guide explaining how we run our program, for anyone that wants to try running the same program anywhere else. But ultimately, we think that sort of automating a lot of it is going to make it more accessible to more people, and make it more kind of palatable as well.
Great. I think you might have touched on this already, but gathering the nutrients from urine likely to have the same issues of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into groundwater and lakes, such as the issue on Lake Champlain with algae blooms.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is exactly your question, but I think maybe it is. So I think the question is asking, like, if you use urine as a fertilizer, will you still have the same issues that you have from regular fertilizers? Will you still have nutrient runoff? And the answer is yes. Like, urine fertilizer is just like any other fertilizer. You have to manage it appropriately, or you're going to get losses to the environment. So it's not necessarily reducing nutrient pollution from that angle. It's reducing the nutrient pollution from the wastewater side. And we encourage people to manage it wisely as a fertilizer. So we have a lot of instructions in our guides on how to prevent environmental losses. So, and in fact, last summer we did a whole research project on how to minimize nitrogen loss to the atmosphere, for example. And there's a lot of research that's been done on that already with manure that's basically directly relevant to urine as well. So if you just follow best practices for manure application, you can avoid a lot of those problems. Yeah, basically, we know how to solve a lot of those problems, but for various reasons, those practices don't happen all the time.
Are there mandatory labels for consumers to know how their food is fertilized?
No, there's nothing like that in the US. So yeah, so most people don't know anything about how their food is fertilized, whether it's fertilized with sewage sludge or with chemical fertilizers or with manure or with fish meal or slaughterhouse waste or all different kinds of things. So most fertilizers come from things that are kind of waste products. So they're kind of, that's kind of the nature of the game.
So knowing that there are other companies in the world, but is the company you work for the only urine fertilizer company in the US?
Yeah, we're the only organization doing this in the US. And we're mostly a nonprofit. We just started this LLC to develop that the technology. That just happened this summer. So we still don't really think of ourselves as a company, although I guess we technically are now. Well, we're moving in that direction. But most of our work is done as the Institute, which is a nonprofit.
So what types of foods have you so far used urine as the fertilizer?
We have done our tests on lettuce and carrots so far, but in our home gardens as individuals, we've used urine on pretty much everything. And there are other resources published from people around the world who use urine on all different kinds of crops. Yeah, we hosted an international conference last week on Zoom with basically everyone in the world who works on urine diversion, which was really exciting and kind of amazing. And we had this man from France who is a urine enthusiast, and he has published a book where he has described how to use urine as a fertilizer on basically every crop that's grown in France. So it was very impressive. So yeah, I mean, it's also has been, we had somebody from Nigeria talking about growing lemongrass with urine fertilizer. So basically anything.
Okay. Do you plan to be able to broaden your horizons and set up different locations around the country to allow for more opportunity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how it will work exactly. I mean, what we're hoping is that this treatment package will sort of allow us to expand our geographical footprint. But I don't know. I don't think any of us really wants to own like a giant company or something like that. So I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe there'll be other people who start similar programs in other places, or we can partner with them somehow.
For your portable toilets, do you still need to add something to the holding tanks for the smell, or do you try to keep it as natural as possible?
Yeah, so the portable toilets, well, in general, for our urine collection systems, we add a small amount of vinegar to, well, you don't have to, but a lot of people add a small amount of vinegar to their jug, or in the portable toilets, we do this as well, which keeps the urine from smelling. And in the portable toilets, we also have different kinds. So we have some that are urine only, and then we also have some that are composting toilets, where the urine and feces are collected together. And for those, it's like kind of a sawdust. We use a lot of sawdust, so it's in my opinion much more pleasant to use than a regular chemical toilet. much more pleasant. I mean, it's still gross, but better. um, yeah. Yeah, so if it's just liquid, we use vinegar. And if it's liquid and solid, then we use sawdust. And those two things work pretty well to control, well, minimize the smell.
How does the urine fertilizer compare to compost tea?
um, I don't know too much about compost tea. I know that it contains a lot of beneficial microbes that come out of the compost. I don't know too much about its nutrient content, but I don't believe it contains a lot of nutrients. I think it's more like sort of a probiotic culture. Because actually in composting, a lot of nutrients are lost. Most of the nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere. But I don't actually know exactly. But that's my guess, is it had fewer nutrients and more microbes.
How much does a person's diet contribute to the nutrients found in urine?
Yeah, that is a great question. Here in the US and Europe, we have pretty high levels of nitrogen in our urine because we eat a lot of protein, a lot of meat and dairy. If you go to like a lot of parts of Africa, they have a lot lower nitrogen content in their urine. And one thing that we actually learned in our conference last week from people who've worked in Asia and Africa is that people in those places generally produce a lot less urine because they drink a lot less water because they don't have access to clean water. And so that urine is much more concentrated and there's a lot less of it. So that would actually make it a lot easier to recycle than our urine here. But yeah, that's a good question.
All right, what's next? How much, sorry, I lost my spot. So how much urine are you collecting on a regular basis? Are you collecting every day, every month, every few days?
Oh yeah. So for the people that have barrels or tanks, we pump those out usually in the spring and again in the fall. And if you have one of those jugs, usually fill that up in, I don't know, a couple of weeks. So some people have multiple jugs and they bring them to the depot, every once in a while. And then the depot holds, I think, 1,500 gallons. And we pump that out usually a few times a year. So, yeah, so altogether we collected 10,000 gallons last year.
How much does it cost to have the special urine system?
Yeah, the treatment system that we're working on, we don't know yet. It's still very much in a development stage. But we are thinking that the people who will really be interested in buying it will be building owners so in some parts of the country that have really bad nutrient pollution, they're starting to have requirements for septic systems that they remove nutrients from the septic system. And this is happening in Maryland and in Cape Cod and in Long Island. And the products that are available to remove nitrogen from a septic system are exorbitantly expensive, like $10,000 to $20,000. So you basically have to dig up your septic system and install this new thing. And so what we think is that what we're hoping is that our system could be an alternative to that. And it may cost a few $1,000s, but compared to the alternative, it's less expensive. And then maybe the price could come down over time, or we could develop a different kind of infrastructure as more people are collecting urine.
Great. We'll do one more question, and then we'll get back to if you want to talk more about your background.
Okay.
So, and if we have time, we can come back to questions. There's a couple more. So last question before we move on. Does the Institute provide internships for undergrads, or would they consider offering internships?
Yeah, we usually host interns every summer. We didn't do that this summer, of course, but we actually have an intern with us now who is here for the fall. And we also have an AmeriCorps program that starts every year in September. So we have an intern and an AmeriCorps member right now that just started. And yeah, it's great to have them. So we definitely would welcome that if anyone's interested in joining us.
Great. Well, thanks. So I'll let you talk about your background, and if we have time, we'll come back to some questions. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's see. So I just wanted to share a little bit about my background because I think for, at least in my experience, it's always felt like a lot of the scientists I know, they have a pretty like straightforward path to where they ended up. Like they always knew they wanted to be X scientist, and they went to grad school right after undergrad, and they did a postdoc, and they became a scientist, and etc. So my path is completely not like that. So, I mean, as you might imagine, because who, when they're a kid, wants to be a pea scientist? Like no one. So, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I ended up here. And yeah, so I'm originally from Northern Virginia, and I have always been interested in nature and environmental issues. I went to college at Cornell in New York State, where I studied natural resources. And I was really into everything environmental. I spent a lot of time in the woods learning how to identify trees and plants and everything in New York. And after I was a little bit interested in agriculture at that time. That was kind of like the beginning of the local food, organic food movement, and I thought that was interesting, but it wasn't what I studied. So after I graduated, I ended up going back to near where I came from, and I worked for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And I had this job that was kind of like, it was kind of like what I had thought my dream job would be when I was a kid, but it wasn't actually my dream job. So I worked on I worked for a habitat restoration program. So I worked with landowners in the state of Maryland, working to do projects on their property to create habitat for rare and endangered species. And I won't really get totally into why it wasn't a dream job, but basically I was there for 6 years. I started the job in the summer of 2008, and a couple of months later, the economy crashed. And I think like a lot of people, I ended up being stuck in that job because during the recession, it was really hard to get a different job. So I ended up staying there for 6 years. And during that time, I was getting more and more interested in agriculture. And I really wanted to sort of transition to working in agriculture. And I applied to a lot of jobs. I got rejected from all of them. It was extremely depressing and discouraging. And I just, yeah, it was a hard time. So eventually I just quit my job, and, oh, okay. I forgot I put this in. So I was going to talk a little bit about, why I was getting interested in agriculture. I guess I will just mention that quickly. So this is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is the largest estuary in North America, and it's kind of the heart of the state of Maryland. And the Chesapeake Bay also has a lot of water quality problems. So, so this is a map of the dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. Again, these areas with no oxygen, they're really bad there. And this chart, this is something that really blew my mind when I started working in Maryland, is the history of the seafood industry in the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see in the late 1800s, we were harvesting 15 million bushels of oysters from the Chesapeake Bay, just in Maryland. There were so many oysters in the Chesapeake Bay that they were a navigational hazard for ships. So you all know what a coral reef is. It's like this giant structure made of coral organisms. Well, there used to be oyster reefs in the Chesapeake Bay, like enormous structures made of oysters. And they're all gone. They're completely gone. So you can see this chart ends in the 90s, and basically oyster harvests have flatlined since then. Like, it's not completely zero, but it's really close to zero now, which is just staggering. And I just wanted to work on this issue. And so as I mentioned before, the main pollutant in the bay is nutrient pollution. Let's see. So I guess I'll explain a little bit more how that works. I don't know, you guys might already know this, so forgive me if you do. But basically what happens, I already explained that the nutrients stimulate algal blooms, and the algal blooms don't actually consume oxygen directly. They're plants, so they actually release oxygen. But what happens is when they die, they sink to the bottom of the water. And when they get there, they get decomposed by decomposer organisms. And those organisms are the ones that use the oxygen. So like, just like we need to breathe oxygen to digest the food that we eat, these creatures need oxygen to break down organic matter. So you get these areas mostly on the bottom of the bay where there's no oxygen. And so anything that can't move will die. Things that can move, they'll be okay. They can move to a different part of the bay. So in the Chesapeake Bay, most of that nutrient pollution comes from agriculture. And that's a big part of why I was so interested in moving into working in agriculture. I just felt like that was really where the heart of the problem was, and I wanted to be there. But no one would hire me to do that. So I quit my job and I moved to Massachusetts, and I did an AmeriCorps year working on farmland conservation with the Land Trust. I was living in Brattleboro, but working in Massachusetts. And that was an amazing experience. And it really confirmed, it was kind of like a sabbatical year for me to like take some time off and try something new and see if this was really what I wanted to do. And it was great. And I decided to go for it, but still no one would hire me. So I thought, okay, I have to go back to school. So I decided to go back to grad school at that point. And at this point I was 33. So most people go to grad school in their 20s, but I'm here to tell you, you can go to grad school in your 30s or beyond, and it will work out fine. And in fact, I'm kind of glad I didn't do it when I was younger, because I didn't know what I wanted to study when I was younger. And by this time, I had decided I wanted, I already had a general environmental degree, so I wanted some more technical knowledge. I wanted to kind of deep dive and gain some specific skills in something, and ideally some kind of technical skill, so that even if I couldn't get a job doing what I wanted to do, I could have some kind of employable skill. So I decided to study soil science. And another reason I wanted to study to do a hard science was that a lot of those programs will pay you to go to school, as opposed to like a lot of the general environmental programs are really expensive, and I didn't want to. I was trying to avoid taking on more debt. So I ended up actually getting a scholarship to study at the University of Copenhagen. So I also had always dreamed of living in Europe, and I figured that this would be my chance to try that out, to go to school there. I had never studied abroad or anything like that. So I got a scholarship to study there and moved to Europe. Didn't know anyone in the whole country. It was a little bit daunting. Denmark is an amazing, amazing place. I'd be happy to talk about it, but that's not what this particular talk is about. So my program there was in agronomy, which is the study of agricultural science, basically. And my focus was in soil fertility and nutrient management. And Denmark has a lot of pigs, and they have a lot of pig manure. And so I ended up writing my thesis on a method of reducing nitrogen pollution from liquid dairy and pig manure, which was, it involved a lot of time in the lab. And I never thought I wanted to work in a lab, but it was awesome. And so I decided that I would continue in that vein. And so here I am today. Ended up getting this job with the Rich Earth Institute, working on almost the same kind of issues. So it's a little bit roundabout, but yeah, I guess that's it. Hope that's, I don't know, feels weird to talk so much about myself, but maybe it's encouraging for someone.
Great to hear the way people finally get to where they want to be. It has a happy
Yeah.
Well, we can go back to a couple more questions here. Could you talk a little bit more about urine treatment technologies?
Yeah, sure. So I talked about the pasteurization and the concentration. So the other two that we are working on are acidification, which is really, you could think of it as pH modification, because it could be low pH, which is acidification, could also be high pH. The system in Sweden uses high pH. So the pH modification, the purpose of that is to basically stabilize the nitrogen. So the nitrogen, once urine has sat, so when the nitrogen leaves your body, it's in the form of urea, which is bound together with carbon, but it's quickly broken apart. And once it's broken apart, one part of that ammonia can volatilize and enter the air. And that's not something you want. A, it smells terrible. And B, you lose a lot of the nitrogen value of your fertilizer, which is not great from a fertilizer standpoint. And also, it causes nutrient pollution somewhere else when it eventually comes down. So you want to keep the nitrogen in the urine. And you can do that by either making the pH really low. That's also what my master's thesis was about in Denmark, doing the same thing with manure. Or you can take the pH really high. So that's one of the treatment technologies. And then the other one is, I should also say, the acidification also helps prevent mineral deposits in the pipes. So that's a problem in some of the early installations in Europe. They would get these minerals that over time would actually completely block the plumbing and was a big problem. So if you add these small amounts of acid, basically vinegar, It just is constantly cleaning that off. So yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is charcoal filtration. And this is a technology that we're not sure that we're going to pursue. It's basically a method of reducing pharmaceutical residues. And so again, we've been researching whether pharmaceutical residues are even a problem, and it seems like probably they're not. But if for some reason they are, or if people just want peace of mind to know that there's nothing in there, it is potentially possible to take some of those things out using charcoal filtration. And the system in Switzerland does do that.
Great, thank you. Let's see, what's next? So just to confirm, so the organization you work for is a nonprofit, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So have you looked at, you were just talking about pharmaceuticals and things like that. Have you looked at any of the nutrients within the food that are grown with the urine fertilizer and how they might be different from regular fertilizer?
Yeah, no, we haven't. That's not something we've looked at. There shouldn't really be any difference. It's the same molecule. It's like literally the same NO3 or NH4. It's like the same molecule that's found in any kind of fertilizer. So it shouldn't. I couldn't really see any way in which it would be different.
Is there any negative outcome that might affect a person during the process?
Yeah, I think the main risks from urine diversion are in any potential pathogen contamination, like not really for the user, but for like maybe the person collecting the urine. So like the person who's doing the pumping, like before it's been pasteurized. So basically anyone handling the urine before it's been pasteurized, there's just, there's a risk of pathogens, just like there would be for someone, pumping septic tanks or something like that.
Great. So those are all the questions for you. Xavier just has a question about why we record these. And the reason for that is that normally all of these presentations are open to the public, which is an awesome thing that NVU sort of for the past 26 years has put together these presentations. And so it's not only for the students, but also for the public to learn about normally what's going on in Vermont, which is we're doing this year too, but this year we're able to expand a little bit given that we're doing it remotely. But it gives the community an opportunity to participate. So we open it up to them. And we're not able to do that this year because we're doing it remotely. And so we're recording them so that we can put them on the website and community members can then watch them if they'd like so that they can still learn about what's going on. So that's the reason that we're recording them. And then just I think we have 1 minute left. Ruby wants to get one in right under the minute. Are there certain foods that do better with urine fertilizer, and are there foods that really don't do well with urine as a fertilizer? Or maybe that's still unknown.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think there are, urine contains a lot of salt, so there are some crops that are a little bit more sensitive to salt. So that's one thing. I don't know offhand what those are. And then there are some crops that just don't need a lot of nitrogen, like crops that fix their own nitrogen, for example, like beans and peas. They don't need nitrogen, and if you give them a lot, they don't really like that. So yeah.
Great. Well, that wraps it up for us today. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I know I learned a ton, and I didn't even know this was going on in our state, so it's awesome to hear about it. And we look forward to hearing more about everything that's going on with your work. So thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you next week.